The strip of thermal paper was already fading when Nessa Orland pulled it from the spectrograph for the second time. She held it up to the daylight pouring through the observation blister of relay station Aiknar 9, tilting the translucent curl so the numbers caught the light at the angle where they were still barely legible. Grease pencil on thermal stock. A combination so archaic that the Telvari science attaché who had watched her write it the first time had tilted his upper cranial ridge in what passed, among his species, for second-hand embarrassment. The number read 7.291. Below it in her own handwriting, smaller, pressed hard enough to dent the paper, cm. The 21-centimeter hydrogen line, divided by a factor she had not yet named, reduced to a frequency interval that should not exist in any natural emission spectrum. She had found it in the cascade data from Aiknar's outer shell, the vast, tenuous envelope of ionized gas that surrounded the binary system like a shroud, and she had written it down because the spectrograph's digital log had refused to record it. Not corrupted, not overwritten. The instrument's firmware had classified the reading as a calibration artifact and purged it automatically, the way it was designed to purge readings that fell outside known astrophysical parameters. But Nessa had seen it. She had seen it twice. And the paper was fading. Thermal stock did that. Everyone knew it. Receipts from dockside vendors turned blank within months. Cargo manifests printed on the cheap rolls that Relay Station Aiknar 9 Administration Office bought in bulk from a Terran supply barge became ghost documents within a year, the thermal coating sublimating quietly into nothing, taking the words with it. Nessa had known this when she reached for the roll. She had known it when she tore off a strip and wrote the number in grease pencil, because the pencil's waxy deposit would last longer than the thermal ink, though not forever, and not reliably, and not under conditions of heat or humidity or the kind of ambient radiation that a relay station in a binary system produced as background noise. She had not known it would matter this much. 41 hours ago, the Aiknar system had been a backwater. A binary pair, one orange dwarf, one white dwarf orbiting each other at a distance that produced a modest accretion stream, and a great deal of uninteresting data. Relay Station Aiknar 9 existed because someone in Terran colonial administration had calculated that a crude outpost at the system's L4 point would shave 11 minutes off signal relay times for the Vashti corridor shipping lanes. The kind of calculation that justified a station but not a career. Nessa had been posted here 8 months ago as the station's sole astrophysicist, a title that sounded more impressive than the job warranted. She monitored the accretion stream. She filed weekly spectral analyses that nobody read. She maintained 3 instruments and a coffee maker, and she played chess against the station's maintenance AI, which was not very good at chess, but was the only opponent available who did not eventually excuse herself to go realign the communications array. The station's crew numbered 12, 7 Terran, 5 Telvari. The Telvari were here because the Vashti corridor cut through a region of space they had surveyed and catalogued for 6,000 years before humans had arrived, and the Joint Administration Treaty required their presence at any installation within the corridor's footprint. They were meticulous, courteous, and deeply uninterested in the accretion stream data that was Nessa's entire professional life. Their science attaché, a slender male named Kethevin, spent most of his time updating the station's navigational almanac with corrections so minor that Nessa suspected the work was a form of meditation rather than science. The corrections involved adjusting stellar position data by fractions of an arcsecond based on 6,000-year observation baselines that no human institution had the patience to maintain. The Telvari had the patience. They had patience the way humans had stubbornness, not as a virtue, but as a defining characteristic, something woven so deeply into their species' cognitive architecture that they could not have removed it without ceasing to be themselves. Kethevin was the one who had seen her write the number the first time. "You are recording a value by hand," he had said, standing in the doorway of the spectrograph bay with his four-fingered hands folded against his sternum in the telvari resting posture. Not a question, an observation. The telvari did not ask questions when the answer was visible. The instrument won't log it, Nessa had said. Then the value is outside parameters. Yes. Then it is an artifact. Maybe. Kethavin's upper cranial ridge had tilted. The embarrassment gesture. Not for himself, the telvari did not experience embarrassment on their own behalf, a fact that Nessa found simultaneously admirable and maddening. The tilt was for her. He was embarrassed that she was writing down a number the spectrograph had already evaluated and dismissed. He had not said anything else, and Nessa had not explained, because the explanation would have required her to articulate something she did not yet have words for, a feeling, not a hypothesis, not a theory, a feeling seated somewhere behind her sternum that the number 7.291 was not an artifact, that it was a signal. That the spectrograph had not failed to record it, it had been prevented from recording it, by its own firmware, by the parametric boundaries that defined what was real and what was noise, and that those boundaries were wrong. She could not prove this. She had a strip of fading thermal paper and a grease pencil number and a feeling. She thought about her father. Dav Orlin had been a geodetic surveyor on Mars. Not the glamorous kind, not the kind who named craters or published papers in the Journal of Aerological Sciences. The kind who walked transects in a pressure suit for 12 hours at a stretch, drove reference stakes into regolith, and recorded elevations to 4 decimal places in a waterproof notebook. The digital tablets that the Martian Geodetic Service issued to field surveyors had a failure rate of 11% in winter conditions. Dav Orlin did not consider 11% acceptable. He considered it 11 chances in 100 that the data would vanish, and data that vanished was data that had never existed. And if data had never existed, then the 12 hours of walking and measuring that produced it had never existed either. And Dav Orlin was not the kind of man who could tolerate the idea that work could be reduced to nothing by a frozen battery. So he used notebooks, real paper, cellulose fiber bound in plastic, purchased with his own money because the service did not issue them. He wrote in pencil graphite, not ink, because ink froze at the same temperatures that killed the tablets, but graphite was just carbon pressed into a stick, and carbon did not care about the cold. He wrote small to fit more data per page. He pressed hard, because the notebooks rode in the exterior pocket of his pressure suit, and the wind on Mars was constant, and wore at everything it touched. He had taught Nessa 2 things before he died of an embolism at 51 when she was 14. The first, instruments lie but numbers don't. The second, if the only tool you have is a pencil, use the pencil. She had grease pencils. Same principle, different wax. She had bought 8 sticks in a box at the department supply store before deploying to Aiknar 9. Because grease pencils worked on every surface in every environment and never needed charging or calibrating or firmware updates. She had packed them the way her father had packed notebooks, as insurance against a world that discarded data it did not understand. That had been 41 hours ago. She had arrived at Aiknar 9 with 2 duffel bags, a crate of personal books, actual paper volumes, because she had inherited her father's distrust of formats that required electricity, and the box of 8 grease pencils. The quartermasters had looked at her manifest and asked if she had forgotten her field equipment. She had said no. Everything she needed was in the crate, and the pencils and the spectrograph waiting in the bay. Everything else was just comfort. She had meant it. 8 months later, sitting in the spectrograph bay with a number the universe was trying to tell her, and a system designed not to listen, she still meant it. 29 hours ago, the accretion stream had pulsed. Not flared, not surged, pulsed. A single, sharp modulation in the X-ray output, lasting 0.7 seconds, producing a brightness spike that the station's automated hazard systems flagged, and then dismissed, because it fell below the threshold for crew notification. Nessa had found it in the logs during her morning review, a single anomalous data point in a field of steady-state readings, and she had felt the same feeling behind her sternum, the same pressure, the same certainty without evidence, and she had gone back to the spectrograph. The 7.29, one reading was there again. Same frequency interval, same impossible position in the spectrum, same automatic purge by the firmware. She had written it down again, on the same strip of thermal paper below the first notation, because the first notation was already fading. The grease pencil held better than thermal ink, but the paper itself was degrading, the coating becoming chalky and resistant to new marks. She pressed harder. The pencil left a waxy groove in the surface. Beneath it, the first 7.291 was becoming a ghost, still readable if you tilted the paper in direct light, but only barely, and only if you already knew what you were looking for. 17 hours ago, the accretion stream had pulsed again. This time 1.4 seconds, double the duration. The brightness spike crossed the notification threshold, and the station's hazard system pinged the duty officer, a Terran engineer named Gavin Rourke, who looked at the reading, shrugged, and logged it as accretion variability, nominal. Rourke was competent and experienced and had been monitoring stellar systems for 19 years, and in those 19 years, he had learned that binary accretion streams did strange things sometimes, and that the strange things almost never mattered. Nessa had tried to tell him. She had gone to his console with the strip of thermal paper and the spectrograph logs and the feeling behind her sternum, and she had said, "The stream is pulsing on a pattern. The interval is halving. First pulse at 0930. Second pulse 12 hours later. If it's halving, the next one is in 6 hours, and the one after that is in 3, and the system's been stable for 4,000 years, Rourke had said. He was not dismissive. He was patient, which was worse, because patience implied that the listener had already decided the speaker was wrong and was simply waiting for them to finish. The spectral anomaly is an artifact. Kethevin flagged it. Kethevin didn't flag it. He observed me writing it down and assumed it was an artifact because it fell outside parameters. That's what an artifact is, Orlin. He said it without malice, the way a mechanic says that bolt stripped, stating a fact, not making a judgment. He turned back to his console. The conversation was over. Not because Rourke was cruel or dismissive, but because he operated within the same framework as the spectrograph. Known phenomena had explanations, unknown phenomena had errors, and the distance between the two was not a question worth asking. She had stood there with the thermal paper curling slightly in the station's recycled air, the grease pencil numbers tilting toward illegibility, and she had understood something she would carry for the rest of her life. The instrument's firmware and Gavin Rourke and Kethevin, the Telvari science attaché, were all operating under the same assumption, that the boundaries of known physics were the boundaries of physics, that a reading outside parameters was, by definition, not real, that the universe was fully described, fully mapped, fully accounted for by instruments that had been built to measure the things that the builders expected to find. Nessa did not believe this. She had never believed it. She had become an astrophysicist because she believed, with a stubbornness that her doctoral advisor had once called either your greatest asset or your terminal flaw, that the universe was larger than its measurements, that the instruments were not wrong, they were small, that the map was not the territory, that somewhere in the gap between what the spectrograph could record and what the spectrograph was allowed to record, there were real things happening, and the only way to find them was to look at what the instruments threw away. She went back to the spectrograph bay. She recalibrated the instrument manually, bypassing the firmware's parametric filters. This required overriding a safety lockout that existed to prevent exactly this kind of tampering, and she did it by entering her administrator credentials and appending a maintenance justification code that she invented on the spot. Her hands were steady. Her pulse was not. The lockout screen displayed a warning in red text. Parametric filter override may result in UNCALIBRATED data. UNCALIBRATED data is not suitable for operational decision-making. She acknowledged the warning, pressed confirm, and watched the spectrograph open its eyes. The data that came back was ugly. Unfiltered spectral data always was a blizzard of noise, calibration drift, cosmic ray hits, detector warm spots, atmospheric absorption lines from the station's own hull, reflected emissions from the navigational beacons, background microwave scatter from the corridor's relay network. Nessa sat in front of the display and began sorting, not with an algorithm, by hand. The way she had sorted sky survey plates during her doctoral work on Earth, spreading images across a table in the department's basement and marking anomalies with a red grease pencil, one by one, for 11 months, until her advisor had told her to stop wasting department resources and she had said, "I've found something," and she had been right. A transient optical counterpart to a gamma ray burst that the automated survey had missed because it fell below the detection threshold by a factor of 6. She had found it because she looked at every plate. Nobody else had looked. That was the difference. Not intelligence, not equipment, not funding or rank or access to better instruments. Attention. The willingness to sit with data that looked like noise and believe that the noise might contain a signal, and to keep looking until the signal emerged or the noise proved to be genuinely empty. She was doing the same thing now, looking at everything. It took her 4 hours. The station's day-night cycle had ticked over into the artificial evening, the overhead lights dimming to their amber night mode, the daylight panels in the observation blister shifting from blue-white to warm gold. Nessa did not notice. She was in the data the way she had been in the basement on Earth, fully present. Her peripheral awareness collapsed to a narrow cone, her body forgotten, her coffee cold, her back aching from leaning forward in a chair not designed for 4-hour vigils. At the 40-minute mark, the station's cleaning drone rolled through the spectrograph bay, bumped against her chair leg, reversed, and tried 3 alternate routes before giving up and leaving the floor unwashed. She did not notice that either. At hour 1, the third Telvari crew member, a navigational specialist named Rithais, appeared at the spectrograph bay door, watched Nessa sorting unfiltered data by hand for approximately 90 seconds, and left without speaking. She learned later that Rithais had gone directly to Kethevin and reported, in the precise Telvari idiom reserved for procedural irregularities, that the human astrophysicist had disabled the spectrograph's primary data quality filter. Kethevin's response, according to Rithais, had been a single syllable that did not translate cleanly into Terran standard but meant, approximately, "She is hunting. Do not disturb the hunter." At hour 1.5, she found the first thread. A modulation so slight that it was indistinguishable from thermal scatter, unless you were looking at 3 consecutive spectral frames simultaneously, and comparing the noise amplitude at the exact frequency band where the 7.291 reading had appeared. The noise was not random. It had structure, a faint periodicity that repeated every 0.7 seconds, the same duration as the first accretion pulse. She tore a fresh strip of thermal paper and recorded the modulation amplitude, the period, and the time index. She wrote small, the way her father had. She pressed hard. At hour 2, she found the second frequency. Not 7.291 cm, a different interval, shorter, 3.646 cm, almost exactly half the first value. It appeared in the same spectral region, at the same time offset relative to the accretion pulse, and it had the same signature the firmware would have classified as artifact. A narrow, clean emission line with no corresponding absorption feature, appearing for less than a second and then vanishing. She wrote 3.646 on the thermal strip. She sat back. She looked at the 2 numbers side by side. The grease pencil felt warm from her grip, the waxy stick softened by 4 hours of contact with her palm. She resharpened it against the edge of the console, twisting it to expose a fresh edge of pigment, and went back to sorting. At hour 3 she found the third, 1.823 cm, half again. By now she was working through the data with a systematic grid she had improvised on a separate thermal strip, columns for frequency band, rows for time index, each cell marked with a dot, nothing detected, or a cross anomaly present. The grid was filling in. The crosses were forming a pattern, not random scatter. A diagonal line marching from low frequency to high frequency across the time axis, each cross exactly half the spectral interval of the previous one. At hour 3 and 40 minutes, she found something she had not expected. A secondary modulation buried beneath the primary signal, not at the halving intervals but at a different set of frequencies entirely, distributed in a pattern that she recognized after 7 minutes of staring. The ratios between them were prime numbers: 2, 3, 5, 7. The first 4 primes, encoded as frequency ratios within the noise floor of a stellar accretion stream. She put the grease pencil down. She placed both hands flat on the console. Her fingertips left waxy prints on the metal surface. She breathed. The feeling behind her sternum was no longer a feeling. It was a certainty. The intervals were halving. The pulses were halving. The accretion stream was not fluctuating randomly. It was counting down. And something, was embedding a frequency series in the countdown. She reached for the thermal paper strip. The first, 7.291, was nearly gone. The second was fading. She wrote the new values below them, pressing the grease pencil hard enough to score the paper: 3.646, 1.823. Then she sat back and looked at the series. 7.291, 3.646, 1.823. A geometric sequence with a ratio of 1/2. Mathematically trivial. Any species with basic numeracy would recognize it. But the starting value, 7.291 centimeters, was not arbitrary. It was the hydrogen spin-flip transition wavelength of 21.106 centimeters, divided by pi, rounded to 3 decimal places. Hydrogen divided by pi. It was a signature, a declaration, a way of saying, I know what hydrogen is, and I know what pi is, and I know you know both, and this is not noise. Nessa stared at the number until her eyes burned. She pulled a second strip of thermal paper from the roll and began working the mathematics. Not on the datapad. The datapad's computational environment ran on the same parametric firmware as the spectrograph, and she no longer trusted any system that decided for itself what was real. On the paper, with the grease pencil. Because there was something in the physical act of writing, the pressure of the pencil, the drag of the wax, the tangible proof that a human hand had committed a number to a surface that felt like an anchor when the floor was shifting. She calculated the convergence. If the pulse interval was halving, the remaining pulses would come faster and faster, converging towards 0 in approximately 12 hours from the first pulse. But the first pulse had been 29 hours ago. She recalculated, wrote the answer on the second strip, pressing hard. Approximately 6 hours and 48 minutes remaining. She pulled a third strip and mapped the secondary modulation. She had noticed the prime number harmonics, the whisper beneath the voice. Too faint to resolve from one pulse's data. She would need the next pulse. The math said 43 minutes. She wrote the cross-correlation parameters on the third strip, sharpened the grease pencil with her thumbnail, checked the clock. 39 minutes. Then she went to find Station Commander Halloran. Leah Halloran was 48, a career administrator who had taken the Aiknar 9 posting because it was quiet, and because her 15-year-old son was enrolled in a boarding program on Meridian Station, and she wanted to be close enough to visit during quarterly leave. She was competent, pragmatic, and profoundly uninterested in astrophysics. When Nessa arrived at her cabin with the thermal paper strips and a datapad full of unfiltered spectral readings, Halloran listened with the expression of someone who had already calculated the probability that this would require paperwork. "You're telling me the accretion stream is sending a message," Halloran said. "I'm telling you the accretion stream contains a frequency series that cannot be natural. Hydrogen divided by pi having on each iteration. The pulses are accelerating. If the pattern holds, the next one is in approximately 37 minutes. Halloran looked at the thermal paper. The first number was almost invisible. The second was a gray smear. The third and fourth were legible only because the grease pencil had been pressed hard enough to emboss the surface. "Your evidence is a piece of receipt paper." "My evidence is in the spectrograph data. The paper is how I tracked it before I could prove it. The spectrograph data was obtained by overriding the firmware safety lockout because the firmware was suppressing the readings. Because the readings were artifacts." "They're not artifacts. Commander, the frequency series starts with hydrogen divided by pi. Pi does not occur spontaneously in spectral data. Neither do geometric halvings. Neither do prime number harmonics embedded in the noise floor. Any one of those could be coincidence. All three together, synchronized with an accelerating pulse train, is not coincidence. That's a message." Halloran studied her. Nessa held still. She had learned that the hardest moment in any discovery was not the finding. It was the telling. The finding happened in private between a mind and a data set, requiring only attention. The telling happened in public between a person and a hierarchy, requiring credibility, the sum of everything a person had ever done and said and been perceived to be. Nessa was 31. She had published 4 papers, none widely cited. Her recommendation letters described her as diligent but occasionally fixated. She had a strip of fading thermal paper and an overridden spectrograph, and a series of numbers that no textbook predicted. 37 minutes, Halloran said. 34 now. If the pulse comes and your frequency is in it, I'll wake the crew and open a corridor relay. If it doesn't, you restore the firmware and file a maintenance report. Understood. Orland. Yes, Commander. You disabled a safety lockout without authorization. We're going to talk about that later. Yes, Commander. Nessa went back to the spectrograph bay. She set up the cross-correlation parameters by hand on the thermal strip. She waited. The pulse came in 31 minutes. It was stronger, 2.8 seconds. The brightness spike crossed not only the notification threshold but the caution threshold, triggering an amber alert that brought Rourke and 2 other crew members to the monitoring station at a jog. The spectrograph captured everything. And in the data, clean and sharp and unmistakable, was the next frequency, 0.912 cm. Half of 1.823. Hydrogen divided by pi divided by 2 4 times. The secondary modulation was there too. Nessa's cross-correlation caught at a faint substructure within the primary pulse, a set of harmonic frequencies too regular, too precisely spaced, to be thermal noise. She wrote the harmonic positions on a 4th strip. Her hand was steadier now. The fear was still there, but it had been joined by the focus, the narrowing, the state she entered when data was talking and she was the only one listening. Rourke looked at the spectrograph display. He looked at Nessa's thermal paper. His jaw tightened. I logged the last pulse as nominal, he said quietly. I know. It wasn't nominal. No. He reached for the datapad that displayed the cross-correlation output, studied it. The numbers reflected blue-white from the display onto his face, and for a moment he looked older than his 53 years, like a man absorbing not just new data, but the implications of having dismissed old data. The prime number ratios, he said. Those aren't in the standard catalog. Nothing produces those. Nothing we know about produces those. That's the point. Halloran woke the crew. The corridor relay connected them to Dr. Yun Park. chief astrophysicist at the Terran Science Consortium on Earth. Park listened to Nessa's summary with the silence of a man who understood what he was hearing and was choosing his response carefully. "You're saying the source is inside the accretion stream," Park said. "The modulation is in the mass transfer rate itself. Something is varying the rate of matter flowing from the donor star to the white dwarf with millisecond precision. From inside." Park was quiet for 11 seconds. In Park's silence, Nessa heard the relay static, the faint hum of the corridor's signal processing chain, the sound of distance being compressed into a conversation that should not be happening. "The next pulse," Park said. 16 minutes. After that, 8, then 4, then 2. The series converges in about 3 hours and 14 minutes. What happens at convergence? When a countdown reaches 0, something either starts or stops. Have you considered that it might be dangerous? I've been considering that for 29 hours, Dr. Park. Park authorized a Class 2 observation protocol. 2 Terran science vessels and a Telvari survey cruiser were diverted. Estimated arrival, 9 hours. The countdown had 3 hours and 11 minutes left. The cavalry was not coming. 9 hours, the math was simple. Whatever was about to happen would happen, and the 12 people on Relay Station Aknar 9 would face it with the resources they had. 1 overridden spectrograph, a portable analog detector, 6 strips of thermal paper covered in fading grease pencil marks, and 1 astrophysicist who believed in a number that every other system in the station had been designed to forget. Nessa went back to the spectrograph. She used the 16 minutes. She ran the secondary harmonics through the cross-correlation matrix she had built by hand on thermal paper, and when the next pulse arrived 8 minutes this time, having as predicted, strong enough to rattle the loose panels in the spectrograph bay's ceiling, she overlaid the harmonic data. The pattern emerged. Each pulse contained not one frequency but a cluster, the primary having series and a set of secondary frequencies arranged in intervals corresponding to the first 16 prime numbers. 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, 13, 17, 19, 23, 29, 31, 37, 41, 43, 47, 53. Each prime encoded as a ratio against the primary, producing subharmonics that were she worked through it 3 times on 3 separate strips, tearing a new one each time, pressing harder with each iteration a map. Not a spatial map, a conceptual map, coordinates in mathematical space that defined a boundary condition. The intelligence was describing, in the only language it could be certain another intelligence would recognize, the parameters of a phase transition. The accretion stream was going to change state. The energy release would be equivalent to a type I X-ray burst, a thermonuclear detonation on the white dwarf surface, triggered by deliberate manipulation of the mass transfer rate. The station was 2.3 AU from the white dwarf, well within the lethal radius. Nessa put down the grease pencil and looked at the thermal paper strips, 6 of them now, covered in fading numbers. She looked at her hands, black wax on the right, a pressure indentation on the left index finger where she had been pressing paper flat against the console. She picked up the strips and walked to Halloran Station. "We need to evacuate. Not off station, there's no time for that. The Telvari survey archive in the lower hull. Shielded core, radiation-hardened composite, thermolablative shielding, passive air recycler rated for 48 hours. It was designed to protect irreplaceable archival records from exactly this kind of stellar event. You want to put 12 people in a data vault. I want to put the data in the vault, and the people, because the alternative is an X-ray burst in about 2 hours and 40 minutes that will sterilize everything within 3 AU that isn't behind radiation shielding." Halloran looked at the thermal strips, then at the spectrograph data on the nearest display, which was still updating, the unfiltered feed rolling in like weather. "How confident are you?" The countdown is mathematical. The convergence is real. I'm not confident about what happens at 0, but I know what a type I burst looks like, and the mass transfer rate is climbing on exactly the trajectory I'd expect if something were engineering a detonation. Something, not someone. I don't know if it's a someone, but it knows what pi is, and it knows what prime numbers are, and it's been trying to tell us for 41 hours. Halloran made the call. She did it without drama. She was not a dramatic person, and this was not a situation that benefited from drama. She picked up the station intercom, keyed the all-hands frequency, and said, in a voice that could have been announcing a schedule change, "All personnel report to your section leads for immediate briefing. This is not a drill." Then she looked at Nessa and said, "You'd better be right." "I know." "No, you don't know. If you're right, we survive and you've made the most important discovery in human history. If you're wrong, I've panicked a crew for nothing and my career ends in a disciplinary hearing. The asymmetry is not in your favor, Orlin. I'm trusting you anyway. Don't make me regret it." Kethevin arrived in the spectrograph bay 90 seconds later. He examined the thermal paper. He read the harmonic analysis. His upper cranial ridge did not tilt. "This is not an artifact," he said. He reached for the strips with the four-fingered precision of 6,000 years of archival practice. He held the first strip, the one from 41 hours ago, the faded one, the one where the original, 7.291, was now a shadow visible only at certain angles, and studied it the way a historian studies a primary source. "My species surveyed this region for 6,000 years, he said. "We mapped every spectral line and every accretion disk within 300 light-years. We built instruments that resolve emissions to 12 decimal places across 47 spectral bands. We did not find this." He held up the strip with the fading first notation. "We did not find it because our instruments are parametrically bounded. The same boundaries. The same assumption, that what falls outside the parameters is not real." He paused. His secondary eyelids flickered, a telvari stress response so rare that Nessa had only seen it described in xenobiology textbooks. He was not embarrassed now. He was recalibrating. "You wrote the number that fell outside, on paper that was dying, and you kept writing." The next 90 minutes were controlled chaos. 12 people stripped the station of critical data cores, emergency rations, medical supplies, and personal effects. The telvari were faster. Their species processed urgency differently, converting anxiety into procedural efficiency rather than the frantic multitasking that characterized the Terran crew's response. Kethevin personally carried the station's telvari archival records, 3 centuries of accumulated navigational data stored on crystalline matrices, into the vault first, then returned for Nessa's thermal paper strips. "These are primary source documents," he said, when she tried to carry them herself. "They should be handled with archival protocol. They're receipt paper. They are the original medium of a first contact record. The medium is part of the record." The archive vault was in the station's lowest deck, a chamber the size of a large cargo container, lined with preservation racks and humidity-controlled cabinets. No seats, no life support beyond the passive air recycler and a backup thermal regulation unit. No lighting except amber preservation lamps that cast everything in a warm, unreal glow. The telvari had designed the space for documents, not people. The temperature was 3 degrees cooler than the station standard. The air smelled faintly of the silicon-based desiccant compound the telvari used to protect their crystalline records. 12 people filed into a space designed for filing cabinets. They sat on the floor on emergency packs, on folded emergency blankets pulled from the corridor lockers, shoulders touching, knees drawn up. The medic, a Terran woman named Song, was the last one Nessa waited for. Song came jogging down the corridor with the emergency medical kit on her back, and a face that said she had already triaged the scenario in her head and not liked the results. "How bad?" Song asked. "Could be nothing. Could be an X-ray burst that sterilizes everything within 5 AU. What's the station's hull rated for?" "Not this. And this vault. It's designed to survive a stellar flare event. Whether that includes a type I burst at 2.3 AU is." Nessa hesitated. She did not like the word she was about to use. Theoretical. "Which one do you think it is?" Song asked. "Nothing or the burst?" "The second one." Song went through the door without breaking stride. Nessa entered last. Thermal paper strips in her left hand, pressed against her chest. In her right, the spectrograph's portable detector analog output, needle on a dial. The kind of instrument that worked when everything else stopped. She had taken it from the Bay's emergency kit, where it had sat unused for the entire 8 months of her posting, because nobody used analog instruments when digital ones were available. Nobody except people who had been taught that digital was a convenience, not a guarantee. Kethevin sealed the vault door. The mechanism engaged with a sound like a sigh, a pneumatic gasp, as the pressure equalization system activated, and the seal compound expanded into the door frame. In the amber light, 12 faces looked at her. She told them 23 minutes. "And then?" asked Lim, one of the Telvari navigation officers, whose Terran standard was accented but precise. "Then we find out if I'm right about the signal, and if Kethevin's archive designers were right about this vault. And if they were not, then this conversation is the last one any of us has, which is why I'm not going to waste it." She sat on the vault floor with the portable detector on her knee and the thermal strip spread beside her. Each pulse arrived through the vault walls as a vibration, a hum in the teeth, in the bones, in the fillings of the coffee cup that someone had carried in and set down and forgotten. The amber lights flickered with each pulse, the electromagnetic interference reaching through the shielding as a dimming, a breath, a reminder that the thing outside was getting louder. She recorded the detector's needle position on a fresh thermal strip, building a time series by hand. Pulse amplitude, time index, duration. The grease pencil was nearly a stub now, worn down to a nub barely long enough to grip. She held it between her thumb and 2 fingers, the way her father had held survey pencils at the end of long transects, not comfortably, but functionally, the grip of someone who would not put the instrument down until the work was finished. Rourke sat down next to her, not speaking, just present. 3 pulses passed in silence. The vibrations grew stronger. The temperature in the vault climbed 2 degrees as the thermoablative shielding began absorbing energy from the intensifying radiation field outside. Song checked the ambient radiation dosimeter clipped to the door frame. She said nothing, but she moved her medical kit closer to her knees. Then Rourke said quietly, "You saw something I dismissed. I want you to know I understand what that means. It means I was looking and you weren't. That's fair." "It's not about fair. The spectrograph threw the reading away because it didn't fit the firmware. You threw it away for the same reason. Kethevin threw it away for the same reason. The parameters are wrong. The universe is bigger than the parameters." "How did you know to write it down?" "Because the spectrograph wouldn't. The only way to keep a number that a system is designed to discard is to write it on something the system doesn't control." She held up the grease pencil stub. "This is the one instrument on the station that doesn't have firmware." The pulses came every minute, then every 30 seconds, then every 15. The vault walls hummed. The needle climbed. The spectrograph feed became a solid bar. The accretion stream was no longer pulsing. It was sustained modulated emission filling the entire spectral range, a sound beyond hearing, a light beyond seeing, a pressure that 12 people felt in their chests and their skulls and the spaces between their teeth. Nessa kept writing. She recorded the final approach, the last 8 minutes, the last 4, the last 2. The needle climbed past every marking on the dial's face and pressed against the stop peg. She wrote, pinned at max. She noted the time. She noted the harmonics even through the vault walls. Even through the shielding, the portable detector was picking up structure in the radiation. The primes were still there. Louder now. As if whatever was inside the stream was shouting, not in alarm but in declaration, the way a signal beacon broadcasts its identity to anyone within range, continuously, without fatigue, because that is what it was built to do. The needle pinned against the right side of the dial and stayed. Light came through the vault walls, not through the door, not through a seam. Through the walls themselves, white gold radiance that made the amber lamps look like candle stubs held against the sun. Not heat, not radiation in any band Nessa's training covered. Light. Pure and clean, and impossibly gentle for something produced by a thermonuclear event 2.3 AU away. 4 seconds. The light brightened to the point where Nessa could see the bones of her hand through her skin, not X-ray imaging, not transparency, something else. Something she had no word for, a luminance that seemed to originate inside matter rather than reflecting off it. Then dark. Amber lamps burned out. Datapads dead. The portable detector's needle bent against the stop peg and stayed bent. The mechanism jammed by the electromagnetic pulse that had just passed through the vault walls like water through a sieve. Every electronic device in the room, emergency lights, communication handsets, Telvari crystalline readers, the medic's diagnostic scanner, even Rourke's wristwatch was dead. Is everyone alive? Rourke said into the darkness. Everyone was alive. 12 voices confirmed it in the dark, some steady, some shaking, one laughing in the high, breathless way that people laugh when they have just been terrified and discovered they are still here. Song was already moving by sound, checking pulse points and asking orientation questions. What day is it? Where are you? How many fingers am I holding up? The last question delivered with the bone-dry humor of a medic who knew perfectly well that nobody could see anything. Halloran cracked a chemical light stick. Green light flooded the vault. Faces appeared. Kethavin's cranial ridge fully elevated the Telvari expression of unprocessed astonishment, visible across the chamber in the green glow. The other Telvari pressed against the far wall, their garments cycling from white to deep green in a chromatic stress, response their species had not needed in 40,000 years of recorded history. Lim was murmuring in Telvari, a rhythmic phrase that Nessa later learned was a survey crew stability mantra, repeated when the data exceeded the instrument's range. A way of saying, what we are seeing is real, even though our tools cannot measure it. Nessa looked at the thermal paper strips. The first 3 were blank, completely blank. The thermal coating had sublimated entirely, the energy pulse accelerating the degradation process that had been slowly erasing her marks for 41 hours. Smooth white paper, empty. 3 strips of nothing. The 4th strip, the prime number harmonic analysis, the one she had pressed hardest, scored deepest. Equations gouged past writing into engraving still had marks. Faint. Ghosts of ghosts, but visible if you tilted the paper in the green light and squinted. The 5th and 6th strips were partially readable. The grease pencil had been pressed hard enough in places to leave structural deformations in the paper fibers, not surface deposits, but actual changes in the material's topography. Tiny valleys, where the wax had been pushed into the cellulose with enough force to reshape it. Kethavin took the 4th strip from her fingers. He held it under the chemical light, rotating it slowly, reading the faded equations the way his ancestors had red stone inscriptions eroded by millennia of atmospheric exposure. This is recoverable, he said. Our preservation casings can enhance the residual impressions using oblique angle illumination and physical impression mapping. The marks are in the paper now, not on the surface. You wrote hard enough to deform the cellulose fibers. I knew the paper was going to fail. I wrote harder. He placed the strip into a preservation casing, rigid, airtight, transparent telvari composite, designed to hold documents for centuries in environments far harsher than a relay station vault. In my species' history, the first record of any discovery is kept in its original form, not transcribed, not digitized, the original, because the original carries information that copies do not: the pressure of the hand, the hesitation of the mark, the speed of the strokes, the medium chosen under duress. These are data. He sealed the casing. You chose thermal paper, a medium destroying itself as you wrote. You chose it because it was within reach, and because you understood that a physical record of an impossible number has an authority a digital entry does not. A digital entry can be questioned: firmware error, calibration drift, buffer overflow. A number written by hand on paper, by a scientist who said, "I believe this is real," that number has weight. The weight of the hand that wrote it. The hours that followed were the longest of Nessa's life. 9 hours in a vault designed for documents. The air recycler hummed below conscious perception, a white noise backdrop that became invisible after the first 20 minutes. The green chemical light faded. Halloran cracked a second stick, then a third. The vault smelled of 12 bodies and desiccant, and the faint, acrid trace of burned insulation from the dead electronics. Nessa kept working. Even without the spectrograph, even without any functioning electronic instrument, she had the portable detector and the grease pencil stub. The detector's needle was jammed, but she discovered that by tapping the casing sharply, she could free it for approximately 30 seconds before the mechanism seized again. During those windows, she recorded post-burst radiation levels. The background radiation was not decaying normally. It stepped down in plateaus, dropping, holding for approximately 40 minutes, dropping again. Like the countdown in reverse. Like something withdrawing in measured increments, closing a door gently rather than slamming it. She wrote on a fresh strip: step decay, not natural, controlled withdrawal. At the 3-hour mark, Song distributed water from the emergency rations. Nessa drank without stopping her work. The grease pencil was down to a fragment no longer than her thumbnail. She could barely grip it. She held it between her thumb and the side of her index finger and kept writing. At the 6-hour mark, the background radiation reached baseline. The vault walls stopped vibrating. Whatever had spoken through the accretion stream was gone, or waiting, or simply finished the way a signal beacon goes silent when its message has been delivered and there is nothing left to say. She wrote: baseline reached. 6H14M post burst. Source signal absent. Event concluded or paused. She underlined or paused. She pressed hard. The pencil stub crumbled, the last of the wax breaking away from the wooden core. She put the core down and looked at her right hand. The fingers were stained black from 8 hours of continuous writing. The wax was in the creases of her knuckles, under her nails, embedded in the whorls of her fingerprints. Her hand smelled of grease pencil and thermal paper, and the faint chemical tang of overworked desiccant. She had used 6.5 sticks from the box of 8. Kethevin asked her to write a primary observer's summary. The Telvari archival tradition required a first-person account recorded on the original medium, raw, unedited, preserved exactly as written, because the act of writing was itself evidence of what the observer had experienced and what they had chosen to record. She tore off 3 fresh strips and wrote for 40 minutes with one of the remaining sticks, the number at the top. Then everything, the firmware, the purge, the feeling behind her sternum, the fading, the halving, the override, the sorting, the frequencies, the primes, the convergence, the vault, the burst, the light through walls, the step decay. She pressed hard on every stroke. The pencil broke twice. She picked up the larger fragment and kept writing. When she finished, Kethevin took the strips and sealed them in a second preservation casing. His archival note, written in Telvari script on a separate strip, read in translation: Primary Observer Summary, Dr. Nessa Orlin, human. Recorded in the archive vault of Relay Station Aiknar 9 during post-event shelter period. Medium, thermal receipt paper, Terran commercial grade. Instrument, grease pencil. The observer's handwriting becomes progressively heavier throughout the document, indicating increasing certainty and/or increasing awareness of medium degradation. Both interpretations are valid. Both are recorded. 9 hours after the burst, the fleet arrived. The survey cruiser Tethian came first, followed by Holden and Cairn. They found the station intact but electronically dead, every circuit, processor, and data crystal wiped by the electromagnetic pulse. Hull scorched but unbreached. Solar panels fused. Communications array melted into a shape that Rourke later described as abstract sculpture, not antenna. Spectrograph bay dark. Instruments fused into inert sculptures of silicon and glass. The archive vault was untouched. Designed for 6,000 years of Telvari caution, it had survived an event that no Telvari had ever anticipated. The irony was not lost on Kethevin. He stood in the vault doorway and looked at the charred corridor beyond and said, in Telvari, something that Rithais later translated as, "We built this room to protect paper. It protected people. The paper taught us to protect the right things." Outside, the station was a ruin that still had walls. The observation blisters had not shattered the composite held, but every surface was scorched a uniform matte gray, as if the entire station had been spray-painted by the burst. The air smelled of ozone and melted polymer. The emergency lighting was dead. The only illumination came from the binary system's own light, pouring through the observation blisters in shafts of orange-white that looked, after 9 hours of amber and green, like the first morning of the world. When the vault door opened from outside, real daylight poured in, not artificial, not amber. The pure blue-white light of Aknar's orange dwarf filtered through the station's remaining observation blisters, falling across 12 people who had spent 9 hours in a filing cabinet. Nessa stood up. Her knees ached. Her back was a single compressed line of pain from her shoulders to her pelvis. The thermal strips in her hand were soft with humidity from 9 hours of human breathing. The grease pencil marks had smeared slightly where her palm had pressed against the paper. Her fingerprints were visible in the wax residue whorls and ridges overlapping with the numbers and equations she had written, creating a palimpsest of data and skin, signal and source. She did not let go of them. Her debrief with Dr. Park lasted 4 hours, conducted via relay from the Tethian's communications suite. She told him everything. She showed him the thermal strips through the video link, holding each one up to the camera, tilting them in the light so the fading marks were visible, narrating the sequence of discovery and recording as the paper continued its quiet work of forgetting. When she finished, Park asked for the thermal paper. She handed him the preservation casing. He held it up to the decontamination bay's lights, turning it slowly, the oblique illumination catching the grease pencil grooves and casting tiny shadows that made the deepest marks legible again. 7.291, he read. Hydrogen divided by pi. Written in grease pencil on thermal receipt paper. Because the spectrograph wouldn't log it. Because the spectrograph was told not to log it, by its own firmware, by the same parametric assumptions that your instruments use and the Telvari's instruments use, and every instrument in the consortium's network uses. The boundaries are wrong, Dr. Park. Not wrong in a small way, wrong in the way that matters most. They exclude the possibility of a signal that doesn't match any known natural process. But the whole point of a signal from an unknown intelligence is that it won't match known processes. That's how you know it's a signal. Park set the casing down. I've been in this field for 37 years. 11 candidate signals for extraterrestrial intelligence. Every one natural stellar variability, interstellar medium scintillation, instrument harmonics. In 37 years, I have never confirmed an artificial signal. He tapped the casing. This is the first thing I cannot explain naturally, not because the frequency series is complex, not because the prime encoding is sophisticated. It's the countdown. Natural systems don't count down. Entropy doesn't set appointments. Stars don't keep schedules. Something that modulates an accretion stream on a halving interval, converging toward a specific moment that is intentional. That is a mind. He paused. But what keeps me awake is not the signal itself. We'll decode it. We'll build better instruments. The signal is the beginning of a conversation our species will have for centuries. What keeps me awake is the gap. 41 hours between the first time you saw the number and the first time anyone believed you. For 41 hours, the only evidence that an extraterrestrial intelligence was communicating through a stellar accretion stream was a grease pencil mark on receipt paper held by a 31-year-old astrophysicist nobody was listening to. If you had trusted the firmware, we would have nothing. The burst would have happened. The station would have been damaged. But we would not have known why. We would not have known it was intentional. We would have filed it as a natural event and moved on, and the first contact in human history would have been mistaken for an accident. He stood. The consortium is going to name this the Orlan event. Because without you, there is no event. There is just a burst and a report nobody reads. Nessa looked at the preservation casing. Call it the Aiknar event, she said. The signal is bigger than me. Park almost smiled. That's exactly why we're naming it after you. In the weeks that followed, the data from the portable detector's final readings, the ones Nessa had recorded by hand in the vault, tapping the jammed needle free 30 seconds at a time, proved to be among the most valuable. The step decay profile she had captured was unlike any post-burst radiation signature in the consortium's database. It matched no natural detonation model. The 40-minute plateaus corresponded to prime number intervals when measured against the original pulse frequency. The intelligence had not simply triggered a burst and vanished. It had managed the aftermath. It had controlled the energy release's recession the same way it had controlled its approach, deliberately, mathematically, with the precision of a mind that understood both the message and the medium. 3 researchers at the consortium's analytical division spent 4 months reconstructing the complete signal from Nessa's thermal paper records. The reconstruction required scanning the preservation casings with the Telvari topographic imaging system, building a depth map of every pencil stroke, and using the stroke pressure variations to distinguish between simultaneous data points and sequential corrections. One of the researchers noted in her summary that the data was recoverable only because Orlan had consistently increased her writing pressure throughout the recording period. If the pressure had been uniform, the later notations made on degraded paper with a worn pencil would have been too shallow to survive. The escalating pressure was not a stylistic choice. It was an engineering decision. The recorder had monitored the degradation rate of her medium in real time and adjusted her output force to compensate. The researcher's footnote read, "This is, to our knowledge, the only instance of a first contact record in which the recording instrument's calibration was performed by the human hand holding it." The Telvari Astronomical Directorate classified the event 17 days later. The accretion stream had not returned to its pre-event state. It was still modulated faintly, at a level the standard firmware would have filtered as noise, but unmistakably structured when viewed through the recalibrated instruments that had been deployed to replace the station's fused equipment. The halving series had stopped, but the prime number harmonics were still there, embedded in the background radiation like a fingerprint on a doorknob. The door had been opened. Whoever opened it had not closed it completely. Nessa mailed a strip of thermal paper with this observation to Kethevin through the Terran Postal Service. 11 days in transit, already fading. Kethevin placed it in a preservation casing and cataloged it as a supplementary document. His archival note read simply, "The recorder continues to use the original medium. The consistency is itself a datum." The primary artifact, the preservation casing containing the original strip, 14.2 centimeters long and 5.7 centimeters wide, had been enhanced by the Telvari preservation team using oblique angle illumination and physical impression mapping that rendered each pencil stroke as a three-dimensional topographic image. The deepest strokes were visible to 0.03 millimeters. The shallowest, the first, 7.291, written quickly, without urgency, had been less than 0.01 millimeters deep. The faintest mark, the first mark, the one that had faded to nothing while Nessa watched. It was catalogued as primary source document I-001, first contact, Aiknar system. First line of a language not yet understood. Kethovin's archival note read, recorded by Dr. Nessa Orlin, human astrophysicist, relay station Aiknar 9. Original medium, thermal receipt paper, Terran commercial grade, expected lifespan 8-14 months. Instrument, grease pencil, black, standard Terran issue. The recorder selected this medium under duress, with full awareness of its impermanence, and compensated for its limitations by increasing manual inscription pressure throughout the recording period. The final notations are structural deformations of the paper substrate rather than surface deposits. This document survives because the recorder wrote harder as the paper failed. Nessa read the note 3 months later in the same department basement where she had once sorted sky survey plates. The consortium had borrowed the casing for her final review. It sat on the table in front of her, under the fluorescent lights that buzzed at a frequency she had long since learned to ignore. The paper inside was almost entirely blank. Even preserved in the telvari casing, the grease pencil marks had faded as the wax sublimated into the trapped air. The enhancement scans were the permanent record now. The physical paper was becoming a relic, an empty page that had once held the first sentence of a conversation between species. She had 3 messages waiting. Park. The consortium had approved a dedicated research vessel for long-term observation of Aiknar, and they wanted her to lead the mission. Kethovin. The Telvari Directorate had recalibrated the parametric filters on every spectrograph in their survey network, all 14,000 instruments across 300 systems, to include the 7.291 cm band. A band that had never been monitored because no natural process produced emissions there. A band that existed in the gap between hydrogen and silence, between what the instruments were built to see and what the universe was actually doing. Rurk, I replaced the firmware on every spectrograph I have access to. The new version doesn't filter anything. If something's out there, we'll see it. I owe you that. She had not replied to any of them. She was looking at the preservation casing, at the topographic record of pressure inside it, at the number that was no longer visible to the naked eye, but existed in the cellulose fibers themselves, grooves and ridges left by a pencil pushed past writing into inscription, into engraving, into the kind of mark-making that outlasts the medium it is made on. She thought about what Kethovin had said. The pressure of the hand is data. She thought about what Park had said. The gap is what gets me. She thought about Rurk in the vault, his voice low, his face carrying the expression of a man who understands he was wrong about something important and is choosing to say so. She thought about her father, pressing reference stakes into Martian soil. Not because the soil was resistant, but because the wind was patient, and anything not driven deep would be swept away. The universe was patient too. The signal had been there embedded in the accretion stream, waiting for someone to notice, waiting for 41 hours while 12 people and their instruments agreed that it was noise. And one person disagreed, not because she was smarter, not because she had better equipment, because she had been taught by a man who used pencils in a world of tablets that the first duty of a scientist is not to trust the instrument, it is to trust the data. And when the instrument refuses to record the data, you pick up a pencil. She opened the desk drawer and took out a grease pencil, same brand, same black wax. She pulled a strip of thermal paper from the department's receipt printer and wrote the number that had started everything. 7.291. She pressed hard, harder than she needed to, hard enough to dent the paper, push the wax deep into the fibers, leave a mark that went past the surface into the structure of the material. The way her father had pressed stakes into regolith not because the soil was hard, but because the wind was constant, and anything not driven deep would be swept clean. The paper dimpled. The number appeared, dark and sharp and temporary, on a surface already beginning the slow, patient work of forgetting it. She pinned the strip to the corkboard above her desk, next to the sky survey plates she had sorted 11 months by hand, one by one in this same basement at this same table with the same fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. It would fade. The thermal coating would sublimate. The wax would dry and crack and flake. The number would disappear. But the grooves would remain, pressed into the paper, deeper than ink, deeper than wax, structural, permanent. Not a record of a number, but a record of belief of a hand that had seen something the instruments called noise and written it down anyway, on paper designed to forget, with a pencil that did not know how, pressing harder each time the medium failed because the message was real and the medium was never the point. The paper was fading. The marks held,